دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. My second interview with my very special guest, Siseko Khumalo. Siseko is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria in the Department of Philosophy. He is also a master's student and has done extensive research on education and changing of the curricula. So last week we spoke on introductory topics, understanding the South African landscape, and mourning the martyrs and the great activists who contributed to that opportunity for us to begin to start finding our freedom. I would not say that we have reached our freedom, that we've found it totally, but it is a start and a step forward. So with that, thank you, Siseko, again for giving me this time.
Thank you very much.
But I'm not
Quraysha.
going to be so kind and gentle on you in this particular interview. And I want to take you on based on our very first encounter and the discussion of Rhodes. You studied at Rhodes University, and from there you've transferred to another white Afrikaner university, which is the University of Pretoria. So, I mean, Rhodes is English, UP is Afrikaner, but both have been strong, what shall I say, instances of extreme violence against black people. The struggle for Fees Must Fall was initiated by the very first attempt, and that was what Rhodes Must Fall. And many people in the South African environment, from young to old, have felt that it was time to address the issues of revering very problematic images, individuals, and of course celebrating these individuals and these images. Part of that would reflect a statue or a name, etc., and that the name of Rhodes University should change. But you felt that it should stay, and I would like to know why.
So, and this is problematic, I know, this is a problematic position, but I subscribe to an older generation of society, and that older generation is the likes of Njabulo Ndebele, for instance, Professor Ndebele, the likes of the late former President Nelson Mandela, and their vision and their view and their perspective, which was that of using the trauma of history to rethink a reimagined South Africa. Now, my work, my scholarship and my training has in large part been very inflected by the tradition of critical pedagogies. So critical pedagogies has had its contributors such as Jonathan Jansen, for instance, in the South African context, Keith Zinn and Porteous. And I point to Keith Zinn and Porteous because they talk about mutual vulnerability, pedagogies of mutual vulnerability. And this is exactly what Prof. Ndebele and, in a sense, Nelson Mandela's vision was of South Africa, whereby we confront our history, so we don't put a bandage over it and be like, everything is okay, let's sweep it under the rug. Let's confront the history. Let's confront the trauma, which is what historically white institutions have done. They have put a band-aid over it. They've said it's okay. They've said we're transforming. They say we've got black faces now on our faculty. We have
Black management.
Exactly, we've got black management. But they don't confront the history. They don't confront, for instance, how the University of Pretoria was very complicit with the apartheid architecture. We don't confront, for instance, how Rhodes University, or maybe Rhodes University has attempted in history, but there isn't an absolute confrontation with the role that Rhodes University played in curating Grahamstown in the way that it is today. And I think that work is happening at Rhodes University through the Scholarship of Community Engagement, where the institution is definitely trying to reposition itself, intervening on local issues in education, on the water crisis in Grahamstown, on the energy crisis in Grahamstown, on the infrastructure question in Grahamstown. But our institutions have not done that work. They do not reflect on their history and their role and their part, which is what the critical pedagogies tradition inspires us to do. It says, look at that history, but use that violent history as a point of generative learning. And that's why I would say the name should not go, because the name can inspire so much more in terms of confronting that traumatic history and using that traumatic history to continue to inspire generative change.
I would say that, and I'm just putting a spoke in the wheel here, that keeping the name, on the other hand, actually prevents that history from coming forth, because it's still a valorized history, and for as long as the narrative is controlled by the same cohort that controlled the narrative during apartheid and colonization, which is basically essentially white supremacy, it is very unlikely that by not changing the name that you're going to put forth an alternative narrative. Because the minute you say go to Rhodes University, you're proclaiming that, oh, I go to prestigious university. I mean, Rhodes was and you're not challenging that particular narrative. For those who have asking for Rhodes to fall, I don't think that they call that you should forget the trauma of the history, but that they're saying is that don't put the trauma in my face as a valorization. In other words, you're telling me I should be proud of attending a Rhodes University. It shouldn't be a moment of pride. For instance, I would like to ask you, what do you think would be the response of people in Germany, for example, who says, let's say this university was called the Nazi University of, right? And so we continue and say, let's just keep it because we must remember what Nazism does. Would there be a sense of, understanding the trauma of the history, and would they accept still keeping a name that says the Nazi University of in today modern day Europe?
I think, again, it's you're placing me under a very difficult consideration of issues here. But I think that there's something to be said about the South African context. And in a sense, this is something that Germany has attempted in creating of Auschwitz, for instance, museums that commemorate the history, commemorate the millions and millions of women, children, and men who died, innocent lives. And I think, in a way, what we're attempting to do, those of us who say, let's keep the name, what we're attempting to do is that we're trying to see, and maybe we've not done this successfully, I will admit that, right? We're trying to curate a space where the name is not forgotten in the sense of let us not forget the history, because, for instance, in Jewish history today, it's always that question of never forget what happened, never ever forget. So the idea is to say, let us not forget the name, let us not forget the history, where, for instance, the cathedral, the Anglican cathedral in Grahamstown is built on the kraal of Makana. And then, of course, the geography has a very interesting conversation with each other in terms of the arch, the Rhodes University arch, with the, the cathedral. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening there, and I think that by keeping the name, we're inviting a conversation there that says, let's look at what is this history, what is embedded in this history. Why do we have toposcopes in Grahamstown? Why do we have the mirror obscura, for instance, in Grahamstown, that used to be used by the British colonialists to watch the hordes, the wild hordes, as they would descend upon the British colonial settlement? So those are the histories that many of our students in Grahamstown have forgotten. They don't even know where the mirror obscura is. They don't even know what where the toposcopes are. Okay,
but I'm going to interrupt you here now. You're saying let's recall this history by keeping that name. But this name has been here forever, right? From whatever. And it's 24 years already into the transition of this neo-apartheid state of South Africa. And that new development that you're talking about has not matured as yet, nor has it even begun to appear. You speak about till today, I'm sure that many of the students don't know about this. And you speak of never forget, yet if you take that as an example, then I'll say already that's problematic, because if you look at what the Zionists are doing in Palestine, it's a question of never forget, but do it to somebody else, you know? So why keep the name Rhodes when you can give a more contextually relevant name that will invigorate first a sense of black pride, black consciousness, reinvigorate the black identity, and at the same time create a space on the campus or underneath, say, formerly known as Rhodes University of South Africa. Use the term formerly known as, and so that people must ask, why was it changed from Rhodes to this? The minute you see that formerly known as, it already puts a question. Yes, that question.
So,
and it's you know what, it's doing it differently. So to hell with the rest of the world if they don't do it and don't have a formally, it's just not politically correct. We don't care. What we care about is reinitiating our dignity, our humanity, our South African identity, and it's about keeping in touch with that trauma, that history that you speak about. It's what matters to us.
I think, and this is why I'm saying that, you know, maybe we have not done it as effectively. Those of us who subscribe to, critical pedagogy's tradition. And yes, I understand that there is that, why not change it and then inspire that conversation by saying formerly known as Rhodes University. And there are so many things, in a sense, that are at play in terms of Rhodes University, because during the mergers in the early 2000s, for instance, in 2004, 2003, Rhodes University gives up its campus in East London to Fort Hare because it says we don't want to merge with any other institution, right? Rhodes University remains a research-intensive institution, so we're not a hybrid university. And there are a couple of things at play which I think we would need to unpack first and foremost. But to answer your question short and sweet and simple, I had the pleasure of being a Mandela Rhodes Scholar last year and being in residence. And one of the things that I take from being a Mandela Rhodes Scholar is, in a sense, and I'm not necessarily alluding to complexity theory here, but looking at the nuances, looking at the complexity, and looking at the grey that is in between. And I know that that sounds problematic, and I know that that sounds as though I am now becoming, as we spoke of it last week, the very same intellectual who's elite and who's removed and who's retaining the status quo for their own benefit. But there is a lot of complexity in this country. And of course, South Africa is very different than the rest of the continent in the sense that the descendants of the colonial settler do not leave after the colonial encounter. And we are still negotiating that. That, in a sense, what Grover Guel calls the colonial moment of encounter. How the hell do we understand the descendant of the colonial settler contemporarily who still has a hegemonic voice? And how do we locate and situate ourselves 24 years into democracy, right? Where the rest of the continent in the 1960s, decolonization was already happening, political and economic decolonization. On our hand, on the other, in our context, on the other hand, you have the colonial settlers' descendants still remaining with us, and you only have this very short history, and we are still negotiating that moment of colonial contact. What do we make of it? How do we understand it? What does it mean for us? And I don't know. I'm not even going to lie. I will not suggest that I know. I don't know.
Well, that's a powerful, very powerful and honest answer, and I appreciate that. But we have to go to a break. When we come back, I'm going to probe Siseko a little further. We'll see you when we come back.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the final segment of the second interview today with Siseko. And we ended on a very, very powerful note. Something that I truly appreciate is when an intellectual and academic has the humble approach to say, I don't know. And that is the most dynamic moment in any academic life. So that was, for me, that was the moment in the interview. But Siseko, we face many challenges here in South Africa, and part of that is looking at curriculum transformation. And I know that you are very earnestly involved in assessing how curriculum has changed. And in this last part, I would like you to just take us through, the white paper on higher education, what it envisioned on curriculum transformation, and what you make of it, and from it 24 years down the line.
So white paper 1997 talks to higher education transformation. And that was under Minister Bengu's leadership. Minister Bengu was former Vice Chancellor of Fort Hare, the first black Vice Chancellor of Fort Hare in nearly, I think at the time that he was appointed Vice Chancellor, it had been about 70 some odd years that the institution was in existence, right? And it's defined as a historically black university, but the first time that it receives a black administrator is 70 years on into its life. So Minister Bengu then gets appointed into the Ministry of Education in South Africa at the time under Mandela's administration. And I understand Minister Bengu and the way that he conceptualizes and his forward to that White Paper 3 specifically talks to redress, transformation, social justice. What we then term epistemic justice in higher education contemporarily. So he's talking about the idea that higher education institutions need to act as social redress mechanisms of our society. And subsequently, that's when that particular conversation then inspires the idea of institutional mergers in the early 2000s, where our institutions, historically black universities, are paired with historically white universities. So for instance, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal today, you had Durban Howard, for instance, being merged with Westville and Pietermaritzburg Natal. So you have these historically black institutions merging with historically white institutions. And as a result of it, there is a lot of upheaval from all sides of the spectrum. Black intellectuals don't want to work with white intellectuals because white intellectuals have ostracized black intellectuals for the longest part. White intellectuals say their standard is not up to our standard, the black intellectuals. But when you begin to start seeing, number one, the quality of the scholarship that the white intellectuals produce, absolute crap, sorry to say. When you begin to see the quality of PhDs, the level of the work that white intellectuals produce, I'm not too sure.
It's questionable. Yes,
I'm not too sure.
I would agree with that because I've seen, in my own way, through my years in university, how white academics walk white students through their masters and PhDs, holding their hands practically, almost writing the thesis for them, whereas black students are left on their own.
Exactly, and we're left to fend for ourselves, and we're left to. So those are the divides that happened when we decided to merge the institutions. But again, continuously, and this is why you then have in higher education the narrative that springs up in the mid-2000s onwards, so 2008, 2006 going forward, the concept of community engagement. The institution is no longer traditionally defined as an institution of teaching, learning and research alone. It is now teaching, learning and research and community engagement, where we have to address the local issues of our communities, where in our teaching we have to reflect that we are engaging with community partners, where and in fact the South African University then went back to the 1970s, what was in fashion in the 1970s, the concept of participatory-based research, where we have to have communities, where you have to conceptually figure out issues with local community members. You can't come in and say, here's an issue, or here's a solution for the water crisis in Grahamstown. You can't say, here's a solution for the energy crisis in South Africa.
Without actually having participated with the community.
Exactly. So that's, again, another shift that takes place. Again, why? Because we're working towards the normative ideal of creating of South Africa a transformed, socially just, epistemically just society through the institution. But what then happens, I think, more contemporarily, when the conversation is inflected by students who are saying, we are sick and tired of being tokens, we are sick and tired of being superficial, of being the superficial add-ons to the curriculum, is that you then have this idea of, we've got to go back. What is the curriculum saying? So there are curriculum reviews happening at the moment across the country. The CHE, Council on Higher Education, just recently released a report in 2016 where they did an institutional audit of all universities in the country, research intensive, what we call hybrid institutions, and of course the FET sector in terms of training and so forth. What is happening in the sector? Have we achieved the objectives as set out in White Paper 3? We have not. And so, in a sense, what we are stuck with at the moment, or what we are grappling with at the moment, is the idea of how do we do the work of attaining the goals of White Paper 3 of 1997, and how do we locate higher education in a way that it is socially responsive, while at the same time inflecting global solutions and saying, for instance, on the global climate change question, what are we having? What where's the global climate change question happening in the globe, and how do we respond to it locally?
So you say that it speaks about social justice and community engagement. Shouldn't the first question then automatically from there have been that if we're looking to social justice and we're looking to community engagement, the idea is to get as much of the community into the university as possible, and that would be, in terms of social justice, would be the black community that has been so disenfranchised. Yeah, and it took 2016 and the students to actually bring forth that question without the institutions themselves asking those questions and doing everything possible to address that.
Well, I think it goes back to secure in comfort. Yes. If I have my monthly salary, which is a very fat check, by the way, in comparison to other institutions across the globe, South Africa pays relatively well. If I have but we still complain as academics. But if I have my paycheck at the end of the month, if I'm doing my research, if I'm putting out my 2 papers per year, which by the way
it's relevant or not, it doesn't matter.
Yes, exactly. And some of our colleagues are not doing that work, but anyway. If I'm meeting the bare minimum, why should I? Because again, participatory based research is very messy. Let's not forget that.
And it's a pedagogy of discomfort, isn't it?
Exactly, absolutely. It is a pedagogy of discomfort. It's messy. It's unclean. And the thing is, you're dealing with human beings. You're not dealing with a laboratory. You're not dealing with a thought experiment.
But more important, I think you touched on it, is the laziness and the comfort. That we're so settled. It's minimum effort, continue the way we've always been. And we don't want to invest in having to relearn or to unlearn and then to relearn.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that then characterizes transformation, community engagement, and so many other questions that are laden with community engagement. And of course, don't forget that community engagement now becomes part of the ministerial report that we submit, that the Vice Chancellor submits. So this is how we are meeting the criterion. And as long as we can tick that box, we are fine.
So we're bringing a few black faces to do that part of the work.
And that's absolutely fine, okay, which is problematic.
Now we're running out of time, and I want to ask you, I want to poke you in the last segment. Mandela Rhodes. The question has always been, and still lingers, on the problematic appointment of Mandela, and of course of choosing him as the icon. The understanding and the discussion is there has been a certain level of compromise, that Mandela sold out to economic power for political power, and that the collaborating of the two names, Mandela Rhodes, in many ways reflects that and seeks to continue through the pairing of those two names, a false vision of Mandela as the icon, Rhodes as the icon, Mandela the savior, Rhodes the savior, Mandela the focus on education, Rhodes the one who envisioned education, etc. Do you not have a problem with the Mandela Rhodes pairing?
I don't. And again, the reason why I don't is because critical pedagogy is tradition, complexity. Both of them are very interesting, and this is one of the reasons why it's so fascinating for me. Everything in South Africa has been named after Mandela. 25 years later, everybody's asking, well, actually, was he really the person that we think he was? There's a colleague of mine spoke to me yesterday about the statue, for instance, at the Union Buildings, where Mandela has his hands like this. And he says to me, for the first time, he read that as though Mandela was protecting the Union Buildings and saying to the wild hordes, stay out. Right? Protecting the unity between the Boer and the Anglo that births South Africa, becoming this emblem of the continuation, as you say. But I think there's more to it than that. And I think that Mandela then becomes, an interesting point of reflection for us. And adding Rhodes into that conversation then brings back the history, brings back the trauma, and invites us in a very, very confrontational way to do the work of dealing with that history and that trauma. Which I think many of us have hidden from as a South African public. We don't want to do the work of trauma. We don't want to do the work of history. But we are a post-conflictual society. And in fact, many of my colleagues would say we're not even in a post-conflictual position. we are still in conflict.
Yeah, we are still in conflict. I would agree with that viewpoint, but we're at the end, and I can see that we have too many questions, more questions than answers, but that is the work that we need to begin with and to continue with. And as it's, in the decolonial tradition, I can't remember who wrote this, but I know recently encountered it, and it said that there's no social justice without epistemic justice. So we have to focus and work very hard to decolonize the universities and bring about a decoloniality kind of a transformation and curriculum. But thank you for sharing your views, Siseko. It was really interesting.
Thank you for
and I'm
inviting
sure
me.
a lot of thought will still go into much of your development and your maturing as you contribute to the academic space. With that, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم